Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the farm. This is your host, Stephen Snyder, aka Recluse, sitting in for Frank Zero, who, as always, is doing battle with the forces of darkness in the astral plane. But fortunately, I am joined by two esteemed gentlemen in the quasi spiritual booth with me today. One of them is a reoccurring guest. Well, they're both reoccurring guests, but one of them is kind of a quasi regular, Mr. Colin Reed. And the other one is certainly familiar to many of you out there. That is Mr. Christopher Knowles, the longtime curator of The Secret Sun, the writer of He Will Live Up in the Sky, Our Gods Wear Spandex, and The Secret History of Rock and Roll. Chris, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, my pleasure.
All
Really
right.
is. I mean that.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to have you on here. And today I'm doing a show that I'm especially excited to be doing, to have you guys weigh in on. We are going to explore the films of Panos Cosmatos. He is the young, well, I guess he's not so young now. He is the filmmaker behind Beyond the Black Rainbow and Mandy, two cult classics of the last decade. And really, two of the only films that the term classic can be applied to from the last decade. So, yeah, I think we're going to have some good chats here, and certainly this goes into a lot of different wormholes. So, definitely, I think all you parapolitical fans are going to be excited by this as well. So, let us get going here. All right, so to open up a bit, why don't we talk a little bit about the man himself and his filmmaker father as well? Chris, what can you tell us a bit about his background?
Well, these are his only two films, Mandy and Beyond the Black Rainbow, which is just astonishing to me because he's so accomplished. Particularly in Mandy, the technical aspects of that are just really astonishing. His father was a guy named George Pankosmatos, who is a Greek born film director and screenwriter. Did a lot of these conspiracy and war themed movies in the 70s. Cassandra Crossing, which is about a released plague, which is kind of interesting. And he also did Rambo First Blood, which, if you were alive in the 80s, that was such a huge movie. And then Cobra, which was also huge, but is not quite as legendary, even though I think it's a bit of a cult film. But he also did Tombstone, which you and I are huge fans of. I think that's a phenomenal movie.
Yeah, it's one of the best westerns that's been made in the last 30 years or so, at least. Just great film.
Yeah, so Cosmos, I'm sorry, give me just a second here. I've got like a ton of notes all over the place. But anyway, so this is his second film. He worked with his father on Tombstone, doing something rather minor. I don't know what he's been doing in the interim, but he certainly, we are much the worse for him not having made more movies, because these are two of the best movies of the past decade, maybe of the past, of this new millennium. And I just don't know where he gets it. I don't know where it comes from. He doesn't seem to have much of a paper trail. I can't really find any evidence that he's published any prose writing or novels or poetry or recipes or anything. I mean, he just seems to have popped out of nowhere and made these phenomenal movies. But I think that he's very much a product of his environment. If we again, like his father seemed to be very immersed in movies that aren't quite in the parapolitical realm per se, but certainly are adjacent to the borders of it, if you know what I'm saying. There are a lot of themes that, people, especially of your blog, of Vicep, will recognize in the films that he's made. So I get the feeling that Panos Cosmatos, who again is the writer and director of these phenomenal movies, was probably soaking a lot of that up. And I think just being in Hollywood and having some kind of acuity or awareness, you're going to soak up a lot of these themes, particularly if you grew up in the 80s at the time. It was very much part of your environment.
Absolutely. Now, you brought up Tombstone earlier, which is just such a great movie, and we had been talking about that a little earlier about kind of the whole legacy of secret societies in the Old West and what have you. I mean, do you kind of see Tombstone as a reflection of that a bit?
Well, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday were both Freemasons. I mean, that's pretty well known. And one thing that I've talked about, I don't know if I've talked about it on your show, but I know I've talked about it in a number of other podcasts, is that, Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett and all that stuff that we were so familiar with from, movie history and legend and mythology. That was basically a Masonic gang war between two rival Masonic lodges, one which was run out of the top of a dry goods store. And I can't help but wonder if David Lynch had sort of been inspired by that for, where the demons in Twin Peaks live above the convenience store. And, but also, I mean, it's pretty well known that this is how people who organize them, they organize themselves, the settlers, the gunfighters, the cowboys. You're going into land that's, predominantly held by natives and Mexicans, certainly in Arizona and New Mexico, that territory. And there aren't a lot of you. And they used secret societies, the Odd Fellows, the Knights of the Golden Circle, the Jesters, Freemasons, as their unifying, that was their structure. That was their social structure. And this is something that I think has been kind of scrubbed from history, and certainly the history in the popular mythology, is just how much secret societies were the core, the basis of social hierarchy in these territories in the later half of the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's really a pivotal topic, and only one that I've actually kind of become aware of, and just recently with some developments that have happened. But certainly fascinating, and maybe something to explore in depth at some other time. But let's get into some of Panos's films here. But first off, though, I wanted to kind of get into some some obsessions that go into these films, themes that kind of run throughout both of these movies. And the first one that really jumps out to me is the juxtaposition of the 1960s and the 1980s. In both films, it seems like a lot of the characters and even the institutions are very much creations of the 1960s, and yet the films are all set in the 1980s. In many ways, though, with them still reliving a lot of the things that had happened to them in the 1960s. Can you guys get into a little bit about what exactly binds these two particular periods of history together?
Do you want to take that, Colin, or do you want me to tackle it?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm sure this is something you two guys could probably speak about in greater depth, but certainly, I mean, what I was getting from both of the films, because I think it's interesting because both films are different, but they are very similar, and there are these constant, as you're saying, there are like these thematic obsessions running through his work, which you could already get just off the back of these two films. And you have that the sort of the effect of the 60s psychedelic revolution and how that pays off and has a fallout in this sort of Cold War influenced 80s, and there are certain things that pop up in both films that I think are interesting. I mean, obviously Ronald Reagan has a cameo appearance in both films. And obviously it sort of goes back into this hauntological sort of calling back to the past and the sort of retro futurist sort of vision of the 80s that is a vision of the future that is sort of filtered through this sort of 80s aesthetic from a movie made in 2010. So it's that idea of remembering the future through the lens of the past, and you go into all that sort of Jacques Derrida that I mistakenly studied on my master's course and I've slightly forgotten, which ties in with the hauntological thing anyway. But anyway, yeah. I thought as well it was interesting. I read a few interviews and Cosmatos described the central character in The Black Rainbow as, in his original script, I think he said he resembled, Dr. Nile resembles an aging surfer calcified into a reptilian wax vampire.
That's
which
great.
Which is a good, interesting description of that character and how that character has been damaged by the legacy of the 60s, or possibly not damaged. I don't know.
Chris, is there anything you can add to that?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is very much two narratives about the souring of the Aquarian Age and how the Aquarian Age soured and curdled throughout the 70s, and then the 80s. There were attempts to weaponize it, of course, and to commercialize the new age, which was very much an outgrowth of the 60s revolution and psychedelia and so on. And I think that what it's really pointing to is that the collapse of these utopian dreams. I think that the main character in Beyond the Black Rainbow is the personification of that, but also the Linus Roach, Charles Mansonoid cult leader in Mandy as well. It's interesting because I had interviewed Bobby Beausoleil, and I just sort of come across a cassette that I'd made in our conversations, and he talked about that the hippies in Los Angeles and San Francisco in particular, they sort of took off to the desert because things had gotten really bad, in 68 and 69, even the second half of 67, that there were a lot of tensions with the police and in the Fillmore with the African-American community was very anti-hippie, very anti-Aquarian. There's a lot of violence, but also the bikers and the drugs. You sort of had an invasion of bathtub speed into the hate, into areas, Laurel Canyon, so on, in Los Angeles. So I think what happened is that a lot of people took off for the outskirts and formed, a lot of the communes. A lot of, what is misunderstood is that it wasn't some grand, permaculture ideological return to earth. It was really an escape from a lot of violence and bad drugs and police harassment and so on and so forth. So, when the Mansonoids showed up at Spahn Ranch, it was really because they'd been basically chased out of a lot of the areas that they were sort of haunting in Los Angeles. So I think we kind of see this, and it's Mandy almost sort of presents this what if scenario. What if, the Mansons had never been arrested? What if the Hells Angels had not survived in what form they survived in, and taken off to the wilderness and blown their minds and become sort of modern day Comanches? I think that there's a lot of social commentary there and a lot of supposition. I think it's very hard to avoid the Manson connection to the Children of the New Dawn in Mandy, and the Linus Roach character in particular. It very much seems like that, but it also reminded me in a lot of ways of Heaven's Gate in the 70s, how they would have all these meetings in the city, and then they just sort of pulled up stakes and disappeared, and everybody thought they'd been abducted by aliens or whatever, whisked off in spaceships. But they sort of wandered around the desert quite a while, and a lot of national parks and so on and so forth. So I think that this is very much part of the cultic mentality, and I think what Panos Cosmatos is showing us, at least in Mandy. But, let me just back up a little. I mean, maybe what we're seeing here are two films that are almost intimately linked. We're seeing how these two strains of the countercultural Aquarian consciousness revolution and so on diverged, and in one sense we got the corporate kind of MK Ultra-fied human potential figure in Beyond the Black Rainbow, and on the other hand we get the almost return to a primeval savagery in Mandy, certainly with the cult and the bikers, and then eventually, of course, with Nick Cage himself.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little more later. But one other thing, too, about the setting for the two movies, both of these films take place in 1983. And that was a really curious year, potentially the worst period of the Cold War, in fact, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Chris, I know you have a bit of an obsession with 1983. Can you elaborate on that a bit for us?
Well, I was alive in 1983. I was 16 years old. I turned 17 in July of 83. And it was a very interesting year because I was, you couldn't help but be aware of the Cold War, particularly when KAL 007 was shot down by the Russians with a very interesting.
Barry McDonald.
Yeah, exactly. A very interesting kind of Bircher Democratic congressman from Georgia who was, very anti-Soviet, but it was also sort of on the cutting edge of a lot of the kind of conspiracy themes that would show up later, in people like Bill Cooper and so on. So, this is a much more of a mainstream figure. He had been interviewed on shows like Crossfire and Firing Line and so on. And, he was a very controversial figure. And I just remember that this was a big deal. I remember actually being at work the day it was on the news and it was on the TVs everywhere. And it was really kind of stunning. But there was also, I don't know, it's very hard to describe because 1982, in my view, was a very dark year. In 1983, there was almost like, the sun sort of peeking out after a long period of dark. 81 was also very dark. I remember in 1982, it rained all summer. It was, the weather was just, it literally rained every day. It was a horrible year. But in 1983, things, REM, the whole indie rock thing started to come into its own. The whole, the very negative hardcore punk scene was kind of retreating to the margins. But you also had this very strange sense that I think is best illustrated in a movie that you and I both love, and that's Alex Cox's first film, Repo Man, with starring Emilio Estevez and Harry Dean Stanton, a movie that I very strongly recommend that people who want to get a sense of what 1983 was really like, because that movie, I can't help but watch that movie and just be transported back to 1983. And it's interesting because it's always listed as being a 1984 release, but I could have sworn I saw it in 1983 at the Nickelodeon Cinema in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I haven't been able to find any proof of that, but I could have sworn I saw it in 1983. But the music, the soundtrack, everything about that movie just really encapsulates the time period. So you have this, overlap between ufology and government, Cold War shenanigans. You have the fundamentalist preacher. You have synchronicity. You have this burned out hippie. The whole plate of shrimp dialogue, and the punk rockers who turned to crime, which was starting in that period. Yeah.
Scientology.
Scientology. Yeah. It's just such a great encapsulation of that period. If you want to know how like 1983 felt to me, at least, watch that movie. But there are also some really interesting other movies that came out. Wavelength, which is a film that I know Frank is a big fan of, which goes into Laurel Canyon and Lookout Mountain and so on. Years before anybody knew about that stuff through Dave McGowan. Then, there was also Brainstorm with Christopher Walken and Natalie Wood, which, was a huge controversy because she had died under rather mysterious circumstances prior to that. That was a Douglas Trumbull movie, who was one of the effects people on 2001. But that sort of ties into the weaponization of the kind of work that was being done at SRI and so on and so forth, mind control and everything like that. And then Walken was also in another really interesting movie that I think has ties into these films and also into Stranger Things, and that's The Dead Zone, with another movie starring Christopher Walken. So there was all these kind of high weirdness that was really starting to seep into the mainstream that year, after being very underground, and that kind of cosmic trigger, Illuminatus. Just that whole weird 1974 counterculture finally started to seep into movies that you go see at the multiplex and whatnot. And it's interesting too, that because Panos Cosmatos was born in 1974, and that was boy,
Oh,
what he
wow.
born in, yeah.
Yeah. No, that definitely made him pretty star-crossed, I would say, certainly. Oh, man. All right. So, okay, another big reoccurring theme in these movies is LSD. Okay, but Panos has a really, really distinct take on this from most other works and how it's depicted in fiction. I wanted to see if you guys could get into that. Like, Colin, do you want to start off with that?
Yeah, well, I sort of almost feel watching Mandy is that it's, in a lot of ways, you could say it's just a bog standard 80s revenge thriller, but it's just, taken a heroic dose and dived off the cliff into a Boris Vallejo or Julie Bell painting. And I think maybe even the music is part of that as well, because the music just creates this intense mood, particularly in you're just saying there, Chris, in Black Rainbow with the very synth heavy score, which calls back to like Tangerine Dream.
Yeah, I was
for
going to
me,
say it's
really.
almost like a Tangerine Dream album.
Which takes it right back around to the Stranger Things, because obviously that's very, there's so much of that in just the theme tune, and then it's that. I think Kobasantos describes Mandy as being what did he? I think he said it was like a psychedelic heavy metal rock opera, whereas the first album was more like sort of ambient prog or whatever. But it's that dismissal of linearity, whereby an actual 3 or 5 act script becomes irrelevant within the context of those films. I think he also said in some interviews that there were scenes in Black Rainbow that had more explicit dialogue explaining particular aspects of the plot, and he cut those out because he felt that wasn't necessary to the film he was trying to make. And yeah, I mean, it's both of them revolve around entheogens, which is a common thing that I've seen in a few other recent movies, which I might mention later on. But yeah, you have characters that go on these. They don't go on a sort of a journey as such. They just more descend into the proverbial underworld and don't necessarily come back out of it. And with those other connections to 80s films, I was also thinking a lot. The Tangerine Dream connection made me think immediately of Firestarter, which was, of course, a Stephen King adaptation, and of course is pretty much one of the primary influences on Stranger Things, which also has that whole going back in time to the 80s nostalgia thing. So it all sort of lines up together quite nicely.
Absolutely. Chris, is there anything you can add about Panos' take on LSD?
Well, the one thing that I was really struck by, I just rewatched the bad trip scene in Beyond the Black Rainbow last night. I feel like he's had a lot of bad experience with psychedelics, but it's almost like the Bart Simpson goof in the science fair where he can't stop touching the the live electricity. I almost get the feeling that he had some really profoundly bad trips and just went back for more because he might have been after something. It reminded me in a lot of ways of the Ken Russell film Altered States, which which I'm a huge fan of. I'm also a huge fan of the book, which is written by Patty Chayefsky. And that's a book that I think that everyone should read and see the film. I get the sense that there's a lot of continuity with that. I would actually say that his take is a lot more evocative and effective than Altered States, which is very 70s rock opera kind of goofy, over the top. I mean, Ken Russell is always going to go over the top, whatever he's doing. But I just get the sense that he had, we're talking about Panos Cosmatos now. I get the sense that he had a lot of experience, bad experience with psychedelics, and that informs a lot of his work.
Yes, very much so. And so the final theme that I really wanted to tackle before we start dissecting both of these films in depth is the reoccurring theme of trauma. This was really driven home to me by an early scene in Mandy where the title character is with the Nick Cage character, and she recounts a moment from her childhood where her father had gotten these birds, I think they were sterlings or something like that, and put them in a bag, and then he had gathered the neighborhood kids around and basically had them take turns hitting them with a crowbar, which, if you've really studied anything about serial killers, that's a good way to kind of set a kid on a path to become a psychopath down the road. But certainly that is not the only instance of trauma being forced upon children and really a number of other people in these films. You guys weigh on a little bit about that. Do you want to start with that, Colin?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a constant thing, really, I guess from our perspective, because, I mean, you have the thing in Black Rainbow with the central character of, the young girl who's being kept in this institution. And it seems sort of maybe purposefully vague about what has actually happened to her, but I think it's like the previous runner of this Arboria Institute, tried to select her as being a sort of an augur of a new age, right? And she was in some way inducted into this cult/institution. And again, the full story of it, I don't think is explicit on screen, but we can only infer that a lot of unpleasant stuff has been done to her, presumably by Arboria and Dr. Nile after that, And as with Mandy, I mean, the whole thing, again, it's with Mandy as well, you have vagueness there, it's interesting when filmmakers are vague about stuff. And critics will say, "Oh, well, that's bad filmmaking, right? You didn't explain what the actual storyline was. What are these characters' backstory? We never find out, right?" But in Mandy, with Red and Mandy, all we really learn about Red is that he's a logger, right? And strangely, when you see logging in films, and maybe it's because I'm not American, I see that idea of the American pines and cabins in the woods. The phrase log cabin immediately makes me think of Whitley Strieber's Communion, which I read when I think I was 8 years old, and it was indelibly seared into my brain. So I sort of see a sort of alien abduction narrative in it as well. You look at in Mandy, you have these, ostensibly they're bikers, but they're Cenobites, right? It's like they've just wandered in out of the Clive Barker universe into this, and they have this, they've gone over to the dark side on whatever drugs they're on, and have come back from inside the Hellraiser puzzle box, and they are going to put their existential torture onto the unfortunate couple of Red and Mandy. And because Red presumably is au fait with chainsaws, which is something you realize right at the start. Well, he's handy with a chainsaw, so that'll probably come in handy later on. So bad things have obviously happened to Red and Mandy, and this horrific incident where they're both tortured and killed leads Red to just unleash the fury of his inner self,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely saw them both as kind of suffering from trauma from the 1960s. It's kind of implied that she was, maybe a former flower child who had had some bad experiences. And with the Nick Cage character's age, I would assume he was almost surely a Vietnam veteran. So, I mean, you can kind of see, sort of this unspoken, just horrors that ling over them, so to speak. But Chris, can you add anything to that?
I don't know why I came away with this impression, but I thought it was definitely indicated that he was a Vietnam veteran, and that he had kind of taken off to the woods to escape his own trauma. I'm not exactly sure why I came away with that certainty, but that's kind of the impression that I got.
It's never, I think, explicitly said, but I mean, yeah, I think that was definitely what you were supposed to assume. And then also with his buddy that Keith David played too, I think he's got kind of a military type jacket on or something. So, yeah.
Well, the other thing too is that this is a very strange connection, but I don't know if you guys have ever watched Firefly or the movie Serenity, the Joss Whedon vehicle.
Oh, yeah.
But there are characters in it called the Reavers, which very much remind me of the Black Skulls in Mandy, that the characters who sort of blew. In this case, they were like pirates of something that had gone to the edge of the universe, and it destroyed their brains and their consciousness, and they just came back as monsters. And I get the sense that, we're seeing the same theme, the same mechanism almost in this film, just through entheogens, rather than traveling to the edges of space. But of course, as far as we know, no one has traveled to the edges of space yet. So we can see the Reavers in Firefly as being a metaphor for something that's not uncommon for groups of violent men that have taken off to the hinterlands to sort of go insane, whether biologically or chemically.
All right. So let's start getting into the films a little more in depth individually. And of course, we'll start with Beyond the Black Rainbow because that was the first one. So, okay, getting into that one, what are some of the major conspiracy tropes that show up in Beyond the Black Rainbow? Colin, do you want to start with that?
I mean, where to start? I mean, I guess
I know there's a lot of them. Yeah, that's a bit of a broad topic.
I think you two guys probably know more about that than me. But I mean, obviously there's MK Ultra and trauma-based mind control and all of those favorite topics.
Chris, you got anything to add to that?
Well, one thing that, and I know Frank had brought this up, and it's not a connection that I made from watching the movie, but it's something that occurred to me and dawned on me the more I thought about the film, is that the Arboreal Institute or whatever seems to be very similar to a lot of these places that grew up in the later 60s, mid to late 60s. Like, of course, everyone knows about Esalen, and then Findhorn in Scotland. There were just a number of these institutions, these like new age human potential, human consciousness, a lot of these kind of things that were a lot of these luminaries, many of whom were veterans or still involved with MK Ultra, had taught or treated people or so on and so forth. The way it's presented in Beyond the Black Rainbow, it seems a bit, it's not as crunchy and back to earth and so on, and permaculture as you would see in places like Esalen or Findhorn. But then again, we don't really get a sense. It reminds me of THX 1138 in some ways. It seems like that entire world existed in this white void, because Dr. Niles' brains had just been melted to mush. But I think that there's there's an interesting metaphor there. The way that, you had SRI and Project Stargate, and you also had the first Earth Army. There were all these attempts to weaponize consciousness and remote viewing and all the way up and down the line that had, by this time, certainly by 1983, had just gotten very strange and denatured and almost opposed diametrically to the way they had started out. But, it's, again, having grown up in that era, being considerably older than you guys, it's just something you remember as being part of the I guess the background noise. I grew up in Boston. I spent a lot of time in Cambridge, and of course Harvard. I mean, Boston was one of the ground zeros from MK Ultra, certainly. Boston Psychiatric Hospital, Harvard, all these institutions, Boston Children's Hospital, so on. Were all huge partakers in the MK Ultra projects. So it's the outgrowths in the aftermath of that was just something that you just took for granted, and it's not something that I really considered how strange it was until I understood exactly what all this stuff meant.
Yeah, I had a friend who went to visit Findhorn actually, and not to stay, just to visit. And I don't think I think she'd have a very positive impression of the place. But as you're saying there, yeah, in the Black Rainbow, it's very much an insular sort of closeted, gated sort of community. It's almost, You know, like the idea that it is that idea that's hinted at that they're trying to build a new world, but the dream turns sour, and the idealism of the '60s collapses. And yeah, as you said about altered states there as well, and that I think Frank wanted to mention Fringe, which I know Altered States was kind of I think one of the primary sort of influences on, and you go to the obviously the John Lilly talking to dolphins sort of stuff as well, and that those taking those very sort of fringe ideas and you know and where that how that can be reintegrated into the community at large, because of course Black Rainbow ends with the girl escaping and just wandering into this sort of bland suburban environment. And it's an ambiguous sort of an ending because it's you don't know whether her breaking free of that cult, that organization, is a positive or negative necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Um,
I just wanted to just cut in because I've really come to see Fringe as extremely sinister and dark, basically kind of a whitewashing of some really horrible things that were going on, and we sort of see the same theme in as early as Firestarter. Stephen King. A lot of people who haven't seen that movie may not be aware that it is about MK Ultra and so on, and this whole idea of these experiments creating this super child, this golden one. Almost always a young girl, a pre-teenage girl, and this is something that I sort of had when I really looked at our popular myths that we see this going back to the Victorian era. We have Alice in Wonderland, and later on we have the Wizard of Oz, and this whole theme just popping up again and again and again of this girl who is treated with drugs or some sort of trauma and crosses the dimensional barrier and goes into another world and then brings back her wisdom for the rest of us. And we see this in Fringe, but I think that there's a very dark impulse behind this, and I think it speaks to almost like kind of whitewashing of real world kind of atrocities.
Well, on that note, let me jump in here to this particular question. So obviously one of the other, kind of fictional works that seems to have been inspired a lot by Beyond the Black Rainbow was, of course, Stranger Things, which, in and of itself is certainly a much more commercial, work than what Beyond the Black Rainbow was. But it also seems like that it plays into this whitewash you're talking about as well. It's kind of another take on this where, it's really not that bad. Some of these experiments, you're getting superpowers and that type of thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. Could you guys get into that a little bit and just in general the kind of overlap with Stranger Things, especially in the first season? Colin, do you want to start or?
Yeah, well, as you're saying about Stephen King, I mean, that whole thing of traumatized children with psychic powers is one of his primary obsessions. It runs through most of his works, and it seeds into his Dark Tower series, which is, about psychic kids that are being exploited by extra-dimensional demons in order to crack reality open, which, is the central thing. And that goes through The Shining and Carrie and all of those novels. And yeah, with Black Rainbow as well, it's not a pleasant thing that happens. And Stranger Things, it's this sugar-coated sort of a falsified version of the 1980s where we all when I was a kid in the 1980s, I rode about the place on bicycles all day, and it was sunny and bright and wonderful. And I went out and had adventures, but there was some dark stuff. And there's always some dark stuff in childhood. And with Stranger Things, it does make it into a bit of a lackadaisical adventure, There's those hints of childhood bullies and those sort of cliches of American cinema that always pops up. And also the fact that, I think the difference between Stranger Things and Black Rainbow is that Santos uses his influences in a very original and interesting way. And you can detect them and you can see where he's pulling from things like, as you said, THX, 1138, and certain loads of other things. But with Stranger Things, I think there's, other people have written online about how Stranger Things pulls entire scenes from other movies. There's this 180s movie, Daryl, which is about, I think it's a young boy who is actually a robot, and he is kept in a sort of a closeted, gated military compound, and he escapes and goes on the run and meets up with some kids. And it's the exact same thing as Stranger Things. So structurally, there is, let's just say, an unoriginal borrowing and maybe a sidelining of the darker, more real-world aspects of the mind control question.
Chris, is there anything you can add to that?
Yeah, well, Stranger Things is an interesting phenomenon to me because there's Stranger Things the first season, which to me is Stranger Things, and then in classic 80s fashion, we have the unbelievably terrible sequels, Stranger Things 2 and 3, which actually Stranger Things 3 actually made me angry. Like, it really made me angry. It pissed me off. It was so stupid and moronic, and it almost seemed to be the moral opposite of what
it was pure jingoism, essentially, with the Russians and what have you. I mean, it was just ridiculous on so many levels. I'm sorry, I just...
yeah. Like, the Russians were able to build this giant underground base in
6 months.
It's just the whole thing was just, it just pissed me off. It was so stupid. Stranger Things 2 is awful as well, but it's awful in that it's just basically a rehash of the first series. I think the first series, I don't know if it's beginner's luck or whether there were ghostwriters that weren't credited, which happens a lot more often than people realize. Things can be almost rewritten from the ground up by writers who were never credited on a television program or movie. It is a total pastiche, but it's a pastiche in a good way because it takes the elements and it sort of coheres them into a real story, an actual story, not just a narrative, not just a plot line, but an actual story that, where you care about the characters and you care about what happens to them. I can't say that in any way, shape, or form of 2 and 3, but again, it is that whitewash where it's more sinister in its presentation of MK Ultra than what we see in the later series, but it's still like, oh, this is a horrible thing, and the mother's brains were just wiped clean, basically, and but she's got these wonderful superpowers, and she can do all these wonderful telekinetic things. Wasn't that worth it? It's that kind of deal. It seems to me that they got the talk after that, and just basically like, no, you're a major franchise now. You're a big hit. You can't. You can't go against the military industrial intelligence apparatus in that kind of way, even as gentle as it might have been in the first series, because we all know about how deeply invested the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies are in the film industry. I think that's pretty well known by now, and how they will censor things they don't feel present them in a positive light. That's pretty well known that they'll withdraw funding or approvals and so on, or use of machinery, helicopters and so on. So anyway, it is. There are those kind of sinister undercurrents to that, but I think that the way it's told, I don't know, I wouldn't say it necessarily justifies it, but I think that, you can excuse it. You can forgive it, these kind of whitewashing tendencies, because there's so much else of value.
Okay, so the institution in the Beyond the Black Rainbow, I believe it's the Arboro Institute or something to that effect. It was theoretically founded to study the connections between science and spirituality, and certainly these seem to be two themes that are prevalent in the film. I was wondering if you guys could get into that a little bit. Colin, do you want to start off with that?
Science and spirituality. Yeah, I'll pass it over to you guys on that one, I think. But
all right, Chris, you got that?
Well, that was very much a very constant theme. I mean, if you really wanted to describe what the original New Age was, not what it became with like Yanni music and crystals and so on, it really was an attempt to present spirituality in the context of, a technologically advanced society. A lot of this came from a guy, and Frank and I have talked a lot about a guy called Leslie Stevens, who was Army intelligence and also the son of Admiral Leslie Stevens, who, if there actually was a Majestic 12, he probably headed it. That's how high up he was. But Stevens had written a book called EST, or S, the Steersman's Handbook, and it was all about reconciling spirituality with technology and so on. And I think that became, certainly Werner Erhard was very interested in it and named his philosophy and his group and his methodology after that book. Just basically stole it right out. But yeah, this was something that was very much. I don't know if it was the mission statement exclusively, but it was very much what the original New Age was about. And that's why you had so many physicists involved. You had a lot of psychologists involved, science, sort of ed scientists, I guess, in some ways. But that was really I think, the driving theme. And I think that the way Cosmatos picks up on that in Beyond the Black Rainbow is very well handled.
Now, another thing that I found to be really interesting about the film was essentially how it handled the commercialization of the New Age movement going into the 1980s, but also effectively really the outsourcing of things like MK Ultra and Artichoke and Often and so forth into the deep private. Chris, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, please.
Well, that's something that I write about in my wonderful new novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky. That, this is something that a lot of people who study parapolitics have been pointing out since at least the early 90s, how a lot of the activities that the CIA and the Pentagon and so on were involved in had the unfortunate aspect of being at least accountable in theory, right? I mean, they weren't necessarily accountable, but in theory, you had the freedom of information and you had congressional oversight, quote unquote, for whatever that was worth. So the privatization was really, I think, a very canny move to take these activities, take covert activities out of the hands of anybody to whom it could be held accountable. And, we certainly see this with a lot of the military contractors who really were doing the lion's share of the special forces and intelligence work in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. So I think that this has been a theme since the early 80s. And maybe even, 1983, you could maybe point to that was almost, I don't think that's when it all started, but that seemed to be kind of a pivotal year that we began to see these things go from the black into the deepest black hole of corporate privilege.
Absolutely. Well, before moving on to our next film, is there anything else you guys wanted to add about Beyond the Black Rainbow? Colin, let's start with you.
No, really. Just in connection to that, a couple of other films I felt that were related to both of these, really, to sort of act as a bridge were, I guess both you guys know Midsommar, right, which came out last year, I think, which, is another film about a religious mystical community who use entheogens to sort of take them to another place. And from about 7 or so years ago, there was a British film called A Field in England. I don't know if you know that or not, but that's set. It's set during the English Civil War, but similarly, it takes place in a field and has to do with people taking mushrooms and going into a tent, and they wind up sort of communing with this sort of black sun, which is very appropriate and reminded me a lot of the trip sequence from Beyond the Black Rainbow. It's very, I don't know if it's coincidental or not, but A Field in England goes into this long black and white, the whole film's in black and white, but it goes into this long psychedelic sequence where these characters are sort of plunging into the sort of the Nietzschean abyss. So it's interesting, the idea of characters from different time periods. It's almost like in this film, these soldiers get this vision of a future where everything is collapsed into entropy and is being sucked into the end of time. So it's quite weird. It's this sort of historical war film that has a sort of existential futuristic horror about it, and it sort of reminded me a lot of both of these films.
There's definitely sound like some fascinating works there, especially the latter one. I'll totally check that one out. So, Chris, did you have anything else to add on Beyond the Black Rainbow?
Yeah, this is. I have a couple strange selections from the Hobby Horse collection of Christopher J. Knowles. One is Blue Sunshine, which is a late 70s sort of grindhouse horror film about LSD. You know, the hippies, I guess, had taken this LSD in the 60s, and then they had really horrible kinds of flashbacks. You know, and one of the side effects of this was that they obviously become psychotic because it's a horror movie, but they lose their hair, which kind of reminded me of Dr. Nile. But this is a very strange connection, but I'm sure it's something that Panos Cosmatos had watched. And there's an X-Files episode called Hungry, which is about like a little, it's the land shark idea that there's a land shark. I mean, he's in human form, but he feasts on brains, but he wears prosthesis to look human, like fake ears and eyebrows and hair and so on, just as we see in Beyond the Black Rainbow. But also one of the themes in that episode is, the whole personal improvement, the kind of Tony Robbins self-help world that is very much an outgrowth of the kind of things like Essel and things like Fintorn. It's the gross commercialization, the infomercial ready version of a lot of these psychiatric techniques that were developed in a lot of these places. So I find it interesting that there was that conjunction there, and I'm sure that's something that Cosmatos was drawing on intentionally.
Oh, it's fascinating. But okay, so let's get into some Mandy now. Okay, so to start off with, Chris, I got to ask, what was it about this film that made you take notice? I mean, I love it myself and consider it to be one of the best films made in years. But I know you're especially cynical when it comes to modern movies. Just kind of curious, what was it about this one that made it resonate with you so much?
Well, one of the reasons I'm sick of modern movies is back in the 90s, I had been working on screenplays, and I'd read a lot of books on screenplay writing and the formulas behind it. And I had done the Quentin Tarantino method of self-film schooling by watching hundreds and hundreds of movies a month. I would watch maybe 3 or 4 films a day. That I had an unlimited rental at the local video store. And it really became, like the donut maker who can't stand to look at donuts anymore. You really just see the architecture beneath it, and it just becomes so tiresome. And it's almost like a rhythm, like you hear the rhythms. The melody is a bit different, but you sense the same rhythms, the same programmed rhythms beneath it. And I just got so tired of it. I've been tired of it for a long time. And everybody thinks I'm a curmudgeon and I can't be entertained, but I just require more now. I require more from my, I love Twin Peaks: The Return. I love this film. I love things that I can't predict. I love things that surprise me. I love things that I don't know where they're going. I don't want to go see some Hollywood junk where I can just tell you exactly what's going to happen, tell you what beats they're going to land on, tell you exactly how the characters are going to develop throughout the storyline. It drives me crazy. It's so tiresome. And I guess it's a side effect of understanding how this work is done. So the thing I just loved about Mandy is that it was nothing that I expected at all. I was shocked and surprised. It was not the kind of, I just was expecting like a modern grindhouse kind of thing, which in some cases it is, but just the weirdness of it and the surprise and the visual phantasmagoric, that is presented in that movie just blew my mind. And I love the fact that it opens up with a King Crimson song too.
Yes,
One of my
yes.
favorite King Crimson albums, Red.
Starless,
So.
yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, no, that was definitely a wonderful touch with Starless and Bible Black. There, I guess it's just called Starless, the song. Colin, is there anything you could add about why the film resonated with you personally?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I only saw it quite recently, but it's just the colors, the reds,
Yes.
the purples, the ambient droning wash of the whole thing. You know, as you say, Chris, it could just be a generic slasher revenge type movie, but it's just there's so much else. I mean, even just down to that, the scene after Mandy is killed and Red makes it back to his cabin. And there's just this crazy thing where he sees this advert for this thing, Cheddar Goblin, which is like this goblin that's it's this goblin that's vomiting on children's heads, and he just he's staring at this weird sort of, again, this sort of 80s homage weird TV commercial. And then he goes into the bathroom, and it's that long scene where he's in his underwear just screaming and chugging vodka in the bathroom, and it's almost comedic. It kind of made me. I kind of was watching it thinking he's just transmogrifying into Alex Jones here. He's just in the bathroom going, "Ah, I see you, demon! Ah, I'm gonna get you!" And yeah, I mean, it's just it's that thing of pushing it into realms of crazy. And I know everybody talks about Nicolas Cage giving crazy performances, but I mean, this is just a great performance from him. It's I think in recent years he's been making about 8 movies a year because he has to pay for all of the castles he bought, and I think he's like had a full collection of crystal skulls, or I think he was buying all of these crazy things. So he has to make about 20 movies a year. But this is one where he's clearly got his mojo back a little bit.
Well, I sort of see the film as being almost about him in some ways, because, he was a part of the system. He came up and he played played the game by all the rules and got all the accolades. And it seems to me that he just realized how hollow it was at some point, and he just started going through the motions and started indulging in irresponsible and reckless behavior to fill the void that he felt within himself. I think that he's so great in this movie because it's the same mechanism that you saw in Blue Velvet, where Dennis Hopper was not acting at all. He was just playing himself. I actually had known a woman who was best friends with his daughter, Marin, and she told me, she said, that isn't acting. That's basically how he was every night, particularly in the early 80s, before he went to dry out and such, that's just Dennis being Dennis. And I think with Nick Cage, I mean, obviously, I don't think he walks around soaked in blood and bug-eyed and so on and so forth. But I think this is an excellent metaphor for just how the system had just destroyed him and destroyed his muse and destroyed his art. And he was liberated by this. I was hoping that Color Out of Space would continue on in that vein, but I think that was it Richard Stanley?
Yeah, I watched that right after I saw this, actually, and I thought it's the same production company.
Yeah. Elijah Wood's company, actually.
And both films have Nicolas Cage in a cabin in the woods, being driven crazy by an interdimensional force, effectively. So they're kind of almost flip sides of each
pieces,
other.
Yeah,
but Color Out of Space really suffers in comparison, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a fun film. I think it's almost a comedy, Color Out of Space, but it's not nearly as impressive as Mandy.
And I think it's the 80s Stuart Gordon, Clive Barker movie that Stanley always wanted to make, that he always had in him. That movie is extremely 80s to me.
That's interesting. It doesn't really try to, slavishly capture the film of the vibe of the 80s the way Mandy does. But yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying, even though Mandy kind of takes its 80s vision and does something really unique with it, whereas Color Out of Space just seems a lot more derivative, essentially. Um, but anyway, I was actually inspired to watch Mandy after Chris and we had done our Blue Oyster Cult show a couple of weeks ago, and one of the commenters had mentioned that she was reminded of the bikers from Mandy while she was listening to the show. So certainly that was an appeal for me. As all of you guys know, I'm a big BOC fan, and just in general, I was really struck by all of the references to kind of 70s type heavy metal here, early 80s heavy metal, obviously the Black Sabbath shirt that Mandy has throughout the film and her scenes. I believe the weapon Nicolas Cage got was kind of a homage Celtic Frost logo and so forth. But Chris, I know you've likened a certain type of heavy metal culture to a certain type of ancient mystery. I was wondering if you could get into that a little bit and see if it relates a little bit to Mandy.
Well, one of the things that I want to just start off with it is that heavy metal really changed with the rise of Metallica and Anthrax and Megadeth and all these kind of bands in the mid 80s. Even though they were really starting to break through in 1983, oddly enough. Well, actually, Kill 'Em All was Kill 'Em All 82 or 83?
I think it was 82, and then no, wait a minute. I think maybe it was 83. I'm not sure.
Well, anyway, the great appeal of heavy metal, particularly in the late 60s and 70s and into the early 80s, was this kind of Tolkien fantasia. It offered real escapism, not necessarily the kind of grunty AC/DC stuff, but like the Sabbath and the Blue Oyster Cult and the early Queen and Led Zeppelin, they're all sort of very influenced by Tolkien and that kind of fantasy writing, Michael Moorcock, people like that. I think that was lost, as the thrash and speed metal stuff grew out of that. But the fantasy elements and the escapism, but also like the mystic elements, the very heavy mysticism of a lot of that stuff, which is goofed on so brilliantly in Spinal Tap with Stonehenge and so on and so forth. But I think that there was a real power there that, and as you said, ties back to the things I wrote about in The Secret History of Rock and Roll, where you had basically literal heavy metal bands. You had a number of groups that were called the Corabantes, the Careets, the Dactyls, a number of different names that were basically these priests, a lot of whom were castrated, strangely enough, but who would show up in hoplite armor, from the movie 300, right? What the Greek hoplites would wear. And they would create this god-awful racket, by screaming and yelling and using their swords and shields as percussion, but also they had these giant lyres, which are basically electric guitars, because they had these, these huge sounding box made out of, I guess what would have been bronze at that time, these huge metal reverberation boxes, and they would just create this god-awful noise that was used to basically terrify people at these, at Eleusis and Samothrace and all these different ritual mystery. I hate the term mystery school, because it's just, there was no such thing. Mystery cults, they were mystery cults, these mystery cult centers. And, it's interesting too, because there's the same kind of evolution. So the Careets, which were one of the main groups, or, one of the names these heavy metal bands, these ancient heavy metal bands traded under. That means the young girls. And they started, I was reading that they had started off, basically as cross-dressing, effeminate, flower children almost. It was very much the look and the sound and the feeling of the late Aquarian, and how that when the drugs changed, when it went from pot and acid to speed and heroin, that it just became much harder and darker, and these effeminate men became hyper masculine men, even though in the case of the Koreets, they kept that name. But I think it's, there's a very heavy obviously a very heavy mystical bent to Mandy. And I think one of the great things about Mandy is how it captures the feeling that you would get listening to, Secret Treaties or Master of Reality or Houses of the Holy, any of these albums that were so drenched in this kind of Tolkien-esque mystical, dumbed down heavy metal science fiction fantasy world that that was really lost, but I think was one of the main selling points for the music in the 1970s.
Well, certainly the cartoons that you kind of see at various points in Mandy kind of have an air of the heavy metal film, which I think that came out in 1983, if I remember correctly.
No,
right?
That was 1980.
Okay.
Yeah, what came out in 1983 is a movie that I had seen a number of times. We used to have this game. Well, first of all, I just want to full disclosure. I mean, I was just a complete delinquent at that time. I was semi-feral, and we never paid for anything. We didn't pay for food, didn't pay for travel, movies, and we snuck into everything you could possibly sneak into. And we snuck into actually 2 or 3 times. We'd had this game where let's see how high we can get. So we'd smoke as many joints as we could before the doors open, and just to see how high we get, and we'd see these movies at this time like Monty Python, The Meaning of Life. I think I saw 8 times when I was really, really high. And but there was a movie called Rock and Rule, which is it's almost like an ersatz sequel to Heavy Metal, but we just loved it. I'm not exactly sure why, but that was 1983, and I think it has become sort of a. Colin, you know about Rock and Rule, don't you?
I don't think I know that one. No, strangely.
Yeah, it was. I'm just going to look it up now. So, 1983 Canadian animated musical science fiction fantasy film from the company Nelvana. Let me just see the soundtrack. The soundtrack had, not quite heavy metal. It had Iggy Pop, Lou Reed, Cheap Trick, Debbie Harry, Earth, Wind and Fire. It wasn't quite metal. It was a little bit more, I guess, new wave oriented. I remember the song, My Name is Mock, Thanks a Lot, which Lou Reed just basically spoke. That was at the point where Lou Reed didn't even try to sing anymore. He just recited his lyrics. But it really was, the animation in heavy metal is very crude. I was very, very disappointed in that movie. I'd actually seen that when it came out, and I just thought it was awful. And it was, a lot of the bands that were on the soundtrack were very much bands that were at the end of their run at that point in time. So,
Colin, do you have anything to add about the, animation sequences in Mandy? Because they really are quite fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting the way they're dropped in. They sort of come out of nowhere, really. But it is that whole thing. There are moments as well where, right at the end, isn't it, where Red's driving away, blood-soaked into the sunset, and then the camera pulls back to a sort of a. That was the other thing. I was getting a sort of Robert E. Howard vibe. That was what kept coming to me watching it. There's that the golden age of pulp and everything and the fact that Mandy herself is a fantasy artist, and paints these very sort of heavy metal album covers in that sort of over-the-top sword and sorcery, Conan style. And the sort of Conan sort of barbarian vibe coming through it with Nick Cage himself turning into a berserker and, hacking through the monsters was kind of interesting. And as well with the heavy metal angle as well, I sort of feel in a back to front way, there's a scene right at the end of Black Rainbow where there's the 2 stoners who get murdered by the evil doctor. And I think possibly they're murdered because they're listening to Venom on their boombox. I don't know.
Venom.
I think it's Venom. I don't know if the director's making some point there again about the 60s versus the 80s. I don't know.
Well, that kind of goes into the satanic cult panic too. All this was being done to the music of Venom, and no, that's a nice touch. I hadn't even realized that one yet. But that is an interesting point, though. There does seem to be a lot of visual similarities between those kind of old pulp fantasy books, you know, like you kind of alluded to with Robert E. Howard and what have you. Chris, do you also kind of pick up on that vibe as well?
Well, like Mandy is the kind of movie that back in the day you would have seen on the sides of vans everywhere. You know, you would have seen particular iconic scenes. I think that I know that it has a big cult following and it was well received, but I think that if that movie was released as a midnight movie back in like say 78, 79, it would have been a monster. It just would have been almost worshipped, I think, at that point in time, because it suits the aesthetic and the lifestyle that you saw so much in band culture and so on. It's interesting that it's set in 1983 because, and these characters are wandering around the wilderness because that whole Manson thing was over. The whole Aquarian thing was over. You had a fantasy artist in fantasy art was over, certainly in 1983. And, a burnt out Vietnam veteran, or at least two of them, just, it almost seems like the tide had washed away the 70s, which had picked up a lot of the detritus from the 60s, and 1983 for me is really the first year of the 80s. It's when the 80s really became the 80s. You still had a lot of holdover in 81 and 82 where you had, certainly 1980, people were still listening to Styx and REO Speedwagon and on and on and on, like all these kind of generic arena rock bands that were still, releasing the albums with the van art on the covers and so on. So I think that, I don't know how much of this is conscious, but, setting the film in that time when the tide had really gone out on the 60s and the 70s, I think was a very brilliant move on his part. I mean, 82 was, you started having the rise of MTV and, a lot of Eurythmics and all those kind of new British invasion bands and so on. But it was really 1983 when everything that had come before was washed away. At least in in my consciousness. So I think that was a great year to set that film because it speaks to that, being swept away and brought into the wilderness, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we're both BOC fans, right? And
Yeah.
BOC. I don't think that they were. They even appeared on the radar and anybody's radar. When was Fire of Unknown Origin? What was that? Is that 81?
I think that was 81. Yeah, I believe so. Because a lot of the songs in there had originally been intended for the heavy metal soundtrack, actually. So I think by 83, they were down to like Club Ninja or something like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, forget it. It was over. But like I'm saying, I mean, there was a whole, forgive the expression, but there was a whole new wave that just brought in the 80s, and it really started in 83. So I'm not exactly sure. I mean, if you want to get into the whole metaphysics of it, that would be, another discussion, but that would certainly be the significance of that year for me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a big one on so many levels. But okay, so let's get into the bikers themselves. I mean, they're definitely one of the more memorable tropes that appear throughout this movie. Colin, did you have any takes on the bikers?
Well, I sort of, one of the key lines actually, which I forgot about, which again, this is one of those films where the dialogue I don't feel like the dialogue is necessarily that important as with Black Rainbow, in that it's almost used in a sort of like in an ambient quality or like backing vocals or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And you have that one line, which is, it is Nicolas Cage's character that says, I think, where he says, "The psychotic drowns where the mystic swims," which almost, I think, feels like a sort of a mission statement for the movie. And yeah, because it is, I think it's him saying that to the biker guy before he sets him on fire and chops his head off. And then quite brilliantly lights his cigarette off of the guy's burning head, which is the ultimate, sort of move that you could possibly pull on anyone in a movie. But yeah, I mean, it's the bikers again. It's the countercultural thing that they're the outsiders, but they're they're the outsiders that have gone bad, and that it's left to the ordinary man to go up against, to sort of try and redress the counterculture in a sort of strange way, I think.
Okay, so another interesting theme I kind of noticed in here was taggers. Of course, the LSD chemist has that the tagger that he has as a pet in the cage, effectively, and then Nicolas Cage wears a shirt a couple of times too, with kind of like tiger stripes associated on it and what have you. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Chris?
I think the inference in the film is that it represents, the primeval. It represents the savage. It represents the return to nature and the struggle for dominance. The tiger is, and the tiger, of course, is a predator, and Nick Cage really becomes a predator. The whole. I'm not exactly sure about what the exact dialogue was, but it's like, he was liberated in the way the tiger was, that very, I guess, very simple and maybe a little bit blunt metaphor, but I think was very effective.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just saying, with the whole unleashing of his primal self, there is that. There is the scene where he forges this. Well, it almost reminded me of a Klingon Batleth. I was thinking, where he just makes out of nowhere. He's just like, oh, I better make myself a magical sword to fight these guys.
And he just happens to have all the blacksmith tools like.
Yeah, I don't know where he found that forge out in the woods, but it's just. But I think that Kobasantos said in an interview that was intended to be sort of. There's not a logic to that. It's just, no, he needs a big magical sword now. Again, going back to the sword and sorcery thing, right? He has to become a sort of a magical barbarian and slay the tiger, or not slay the tiger, use the tiger power just to slay the monsters. And it's that continual tipping over into the sort of fantasy logic of the film.
Well, I'm kind of reminded of the expression "ride the tagger" too, which is of course very prominent in heavy metal subculture, thanks to the famous Dio song. But also, essentially, it's an old expression telling you to essentially go with chaos instead of trying to stand against it as well, which I think is something very much that Nick Cage does do in the film. Certainly in line with the mystic swims while the psychotic drowns thing, kind of riding that river current, so to speak.
Well, don't forget Eye of the Tiger. The
Rocky
theme.
That
was a big hit in '82, right? I think with Survivor. But I don't know if this was really an influence on Cosmatos, but the old Jefferson Starship song "Ride the Tiger" from '74, right?
Wow.
So, that was very, again, it just ties into this whole idea of, heavy metal and the sacred masculine and the return to a primeval kill or be killed kind of ethics. I think that, the tiger would symbolize that. And there's something, tigers are magnificent animals, but as symbolism and as cultural totems, they're kind of cheesy and a little bit low rent, a little bit generic. So I think that kind of appealed to him as well, because if you really, you could have had a more exotic beast of prey than just a tiger, which is just like, okay, well, yeah, whatever. Tony the Tiger, Frosty.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking, because Tony the Tiger was such a big staple of 1980s commercials for kids and what have you too. But also, Chris, before I forget, did you have anything to add to the bikers too? Because I know that's certainly a topic that you're pretty interested in as well.
Well, I guess it just ties into the overall mythology. Again, in 1983, biker culture was almost, it was almost invisible. It had really kind of begun to wane, and it almost become a cartoon because, in 1983 you had the Ouse Festival with Judas Priest performed, and Rob Halford, entered the stage on a big chopper. I don't think I didn't know a lot of people that were driving motorcycles by 1983. I think the whole motorcycle fad had begun to wane by that point. So the esteem and the mystique, I think, of the bikers would have been pretty much exhausted by that point as well. Very much, again, a 60s thing. Altamont, Hell's Angels, all this kind of things. But, the tie-in, I guess, with the same kind of elements that you would see with Manson and so on, but also like Easy Rider and films like that I think really glorified that culture, but was definitely just over. It was just done, at least where I was by 1983.
Now, at a few points, the title character, Mandy, is shown reading a book called Seeker of the Serpent's Eye. And this is not a real book, but I had been wondering if you guys had any takes on that, if it was, what might have inspired it, or potentially, why he would have felt to include a novel of this, or fictitious novel of this type. And there's, a couple of key sequences in the film. Colin, do you want to start with that?
With the Serpent's Eye, I mean, that was another thing I was going to mention. There are a couple of sort of pointed references to Jupiter and the red spot of Jupiter and the red eye, and also I don't know about the book specifically, but the character of Mandy herself has a scar which is like not really referred to at all, and she also has heterochromia, I think, or at least she has different colored eyes, which is something that I think I only noticed when I sort of was doing some Googling. I saw there was a picture of her, because normally she's, throughout most of it, she's suffused in these red lights. Again, it's that the great storm of Jupiter, which I think is something that he's visually referencing here and there. And again, that's the storm of the id, and the rage that is emerging through his character. And maybe even there's a sort of a suppression of the divine feminine that's in there as well, in that Mandy is, suffers the fate of so many women in movies to be killed off and used as a motivating factor for the male protagonist. So I don't know if that's something that was in there as well, maybe.
Chris?
Well, again, it's just drawing from that same milieu. I mean, how many, of course, Venom, I think, used a snake as their logo at some point. It was just very much drawing from the same cultural milieu. I mean, he wanted to create a movie that captured the mystique and the essence of late 70s, maybe early 80s heavy metal and so on. And snakes and tigers and all these kind of animals were very much spirit animals for that whole scene. I don't know if there's a particular meaning that transcends that for him, but it might be something very personal and something that he's not actually willing to reveal.
Okay. All right. So the film revolves around a cult called the Children of the New Dawn. Do you guys see that being based, at least in part, on the Process Church of the Final Judgment? That was certainly a conclusion I was drawing from that. Colin?
Yeah, I think that's there. I mean, I was sort of almost thinking in a bizarre lateral way, if we take the two films as being in continuity with each other, then quite possibly you could assume that this cult is in some way related to the Arboria Institute. Maybe that was the sort of lateral thinking I was doing on it. Maybe like if he carries on making interesting films in this vein, then maybe there'll be a shared world where this thread of these various characters who have been driven to sort of cultic activities by various entheogenic substances might play out.
Yeah, that was kind of a sense I had wondered about too. Is this cult, kind of the rejects or something from the Arborio Institute, or experiments that they had just kind of wanted to shut off to the side or something to that effect? But Chris, what's your take on that?
Oh, I just see Manson. I just see Manson straight up and down. I don't really see a lot of process there, because the Process was so theatrical and they were very urban oriented, and they had the dogs and the capes and so on. This seems to be more ragtag and more like a refugee kind of status cult. But that's a great example what you brought up earlier, that Manson having at least some contact with Scientology, or training in Scientology before he became, Charles Manson, and the family became the family. So I think that's a wonderful fan theory, that this character is one of the failures from the Arboreal Institute.
Do you see this as potentially kind of playing into some of the speculations about Manson that Tim O'Neill recently did in Chaos and what have you?
I think so. That stuff has been circulating in the information underground since when did Ed Sanders write The Family? Like 1971, 72.
Yeah.
That's something that's become really part of the lore. It's not something that that O'Neill just burst upon an unsuspecting public. I think that's something that you have certainly written about, and I've certainly written about a number of years before this film was released. So I think that's entirely possible, if not actually likely. But again, I just see Manson. I just really see straight up Manson here, and it in a funny way, it almost reminds me in that regard as a companion piece to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in a strange way.
That's certainly interesting. I can't really comment on that because I haven't seen that one yet, but definitely not a connection I would have thought of off the top of my head. Colin, did you see that one?
Not yet though, but I think I've spoiled myself. I think I read about how it ends and how they address, what actually happens with the Manson murders, and I think they sort of try to rewrite it, or take a sort of a different take on the actual, like not actually present the Manson murders as such.
Yeah, kind of a romanticized happy ending for everything, I suppose. But one of the other things that I thought was really interesting was the fact that they kind of equated this cult, the Children of the Dawn, to the kind of Jesus freak movement. And Chris, I know this is something you've written about a lot, about how the counterculture was kind of co-opted by the Jesus freak movement going into the early 1970s. Could you go into that a little bit now, and maybe weigh in if you see kind of aspects of that in the depiction of the cult in Mandy?
Well, yeah, I mean, I sort of caught the tail end of that movement. My mother had gone to a college called Eastern Nazarene College, and the Nazarene Church were a split off from the Methodist Church. They were more fundamentalist, I guess, than the Methodists certainly were by that time. But I had spent a lot of time on the campus, just being dragged around because my mother couldn't afford a babysitter. So I saw a lot of that, and it was really exciting. I mean, I loved it. I guess it waned and sort of became more absorbed into the overall evangelical and fundamentalist movement as the decade proceeded. But it came out of a really interesting thing, because there was a lot of Christian elements in the counterculture, and then a lot of the songs and so on. And because it just naturally goes to show. You have a generation of Americans and in some cases British youth who would have had some kind of religious upbringing, some kind of religious training, which was more the norm at that point in time. But I think also it was an outgrowth of the drug casualties, specifically the drug casualties that we talked about earlier in the 68 and 69, where you had the speed and the SDP and the heroin and these much harsher, much nastier drugs that were causing just tremendous damage. And a lot of, there's the whole cliche, I took so much acid that I realized I was Jesus or something. There was a character named Lon Frisbee who became a magnet for this movement. Interesting, closeted gay man, interestingly enough. But there was the Campus Crusade of Christ that a lot of this grew out of, and that was definitely a CIA operation. That was, specifically a countercultural movement set up by a specific CIA agent, and that the incorporation of the counterculture into these groups, resulted in Jesus Christ Superstar, which was a very big play and later film and the soundtrack. I mean, I don't think I ever went to a house that somebody didn't have the Jesus Christ Superstar soundtrack. I don't think anybody ever listened to it because it's a terrible soundtrack, but except for the hits. But also Godspell. I know that we had performed Godspell in our church a number of times, our youth group. So there was a real interesting crossover. Unfortunately, what had happened is that the steam was, rapidly running out of the countercultural engine, and a lot of these people were starting to get older and starting to get jobs and so on, and it really became absorbed in, like I said, into the evangelical movement and by inference into the religious right. But they were still producing a lot of like ersatz rock bands, most of whom were just absolutely horrible. Christian rock, contemporary Christian music, as it became to be known in the '90s. But the Jesus Freak movement was really exciting. It was really very energetic, and I think a lot of people tend to overlook just how the air had come out of the countercultural tires after Kent State, after Altamont, after Manson. There was a real souring and a backlash against the counterculture as it stood, and I think that the Jesus Freak movement really took took some of that energy and existed for at least 4 or 5 years. I mean, there's that song Convoy, that horrible song by C.W. McCall, which is one of these things that could only been a hit in the 1970s, but it talks about I think it's like the long-haired sons of Jesus or something. So there were still Jesus Freaks around at that time, but I think certainly by 1983 you wouldn't have any Jesus Freaks around that I was aware of. So but yeah, it was a really fascinating period in time. And of course, as with everything that ever happens in this country, at least, certainly in the UK as well, that the gloved hand of the intelligence community was always pulling the strings in some way.
Absolutely. All right, so the last stages of the film, Nicolas Cage's character drops some demonic LSD, goes through a series of tests, mostly battles, but he also resists a would-be subduction. He goes into a literal descent into the underworld, where he when he finally confronts the cult leader, he says, "The mystic swims while the psychotic drowns." The line you just alluded to, Colin. I'm left with the sense that the Nicolas Cage character went through an initiation process with this, which is one of the reasons why I found this film to be so clever. It's essentially, a chronicle of this initiation process that's masquerading as a revenge flick, essentially. And really, the Mystic Mysteries really stood out to me as an especially, close touching point, if you will. Is this the sense that you guys got as well, Colin?
Well, there's sort of a reversal going on. And I was just thinking about what Chris was just saying there, in that if we assume that Red is a good guy at the start of the film, and then he has these horrible things done to them by the bikers, and he goes after them, and once he's tasted their drugs, he's drank the Kool-Aid, effectively at that point he's joined their cult. He's now on their side in a bizarre way, and then he cancels them out, and it's left sort of ambiguous at the end as to whether, how can he possibly reintegrate into society after he's been through this descent, this trip? How is he going to, is he now the new cult? Is he now going to form a new world of his own, which sort of takes us back around to Black Rainbow in a way, thematically?
Chris, what's your take on that?
Well, I get a very Jungian sense from this part of the story. Of course, Jungian, you'd mentioned the Mithraic cult. And Jung was very heavily influenced by the Mithraic cults, at least what we know of them, which is largely anecdotal. And I think he was going off a lot of texts that have, since been proven to be inaccurate. But I definitely get a very Jungian sense, and having studied Jung for a number of years, I really feel like Cosmatos is hitting a lot of the greatest hits, a lot of the bullet points on the Jungian mystery itinerary, something that had sort of been passed down to us in in a sanitized pop culture form through Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and so on. Necessarily call this a hero's journey, but there's that point in time. I forget which exact line of dialogue he's speaking, but he's speaking in the voice of the Black Skulls, like his voice has been transformed to be one of them. So there are a lot of interesting subtexts and undercurrents here, and again, it's an interesting process because when you immerse yourself in this material, you're almost becoming not always conscious of the themes that you're processing, but you're processing them nonetheless. And one of the things that I've always been fascinated in is unconscious or inadvertent use of certain mythological symbols and in certain plot tropes and so on. I think that's a really fascinating thing. So I don't know how much of this is necessarily conscious with Cosmatos. I would venture to guess that a lot of it is, but I just don't want to speak for him. But yeah, this is very much a Mithraic initiation, because the Mithraic initiation and your step up the ladder through the various degrees. It was all trial by ordeal, and one of the initiations, and I believe it was for the first degree, is that you're basically pumped full of drugs and put in a pit that was covered by a grate, and then a bull would, his neck would be severed and you'd become soaked in the blood. That was your baptism, baptized in blood and so on. And of course we know that symbology from the most famous icon of Mithraic mystery is the Tauroctony. So yeah, I get a sense that Cosmatos has read not a small amount of Jung, and has probably at least read a few good books on the ancient mystery cults.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a really fascinating subtext to this particular film. So I had one final question for Manny for you guys, and it pertains to that final sequence at the end, which is just really fabulous, with the Nicolas Cage character driving away in his car after he has slain the proverbial monsters. The camera pans back, and we see that just amazingly surreal sky that seems to have been inspired by those, animation sequences that have been present throughout the film. I know we've touched on this scene a little bit before, but I found it to be such a fitting into this, and I just wanted to get your guys' take on what exactly Panos is trying to convey with this. Is the Nicolas Cage character dead? Is he ascended to another reality or something to that effect? Colin, I know you've already spoken a bit about this. I was just wondering if you had a little bit more to add to it.
Yeah, well, you have that mirroring as well, which again is a complete mirroring of the scene from Black Rainbow, where he's in the car driving and he turns to look at his hysterical, blood-caked face grinning at Mandy, who's seemingly sat beside him in the car. And in Black Rainbow, you have a similar sequence where Dr. Nile is in the car driving, and he turns to actually look at his previous self once he's turned into the sort of skinhead, leather Nordic alien monster. And it's interesting that those two sequences are very, very similar. And they sort of echo each other. And in Black Rainbow, you have the cat, and he turns and says to his previous self, "You've done so well," which is almost slightly comedic. But it's I don't know, it's that whole thing of reconciling with the past and reconciling with your previous worldviews that have been shattered by interactions with, a sort of knowledge beyond your ken, I think. And it is left ambiguous in Mandy, and I like an amount of purposeful ambiguity of where you're not sure where it's going, and has he crossed over into some other universe now? The fact that he's surrounded by, there's planets and there's two moons in the sky, and we're somehow on an alien planet now, perhaps, that he's just crossed the Rubicon by slaughtering all of these interdimensional beings, and now he's gained access to where they're from,
Chris?
I got to tell you, I don't know if you guys picked up on this, but when that whole scene, that great shot of, him bug-eyed and soaked in blood, that reminded me of so much of Bruce Campbell in The Evil Dead.
Oh yeah.
That whole iconic image as well. And it's interesting too because you have the chainsaw and you have a lot of strands of commonality. I think. I mean, Mandy is an infinitely better film than The Evil Dead. Infinitely more interesting and textured and layered and stuff. But it seems to me that there's almost a lot of inspiration there, thematically. Even with the voices, right? The voices in The Evil Dead, those kind of Cookie Monster voices in those films. So I think that there's definitely a very conscious inspiration going on there. And, as far as the vision at the end, I think that's just, that he has broken through either to utter madness and delusion or to sainthood, where his, the dead have returned and his wishes can be granted and so on. So I guess it all depends on what your personal interpretation of that would be. But it seems to me that that's just an indication of just how completely beyond normal human reality this character now is living in.
Yeah, I mean, it's just... Oh, go ahead, Colin.
So no, I was just going to say there, it's like taking a perfectly cliched movie trope and pitch bending it like a My Bloody Valentine album,
Yeah, it's so just fabulously, it's almost like, the kind of ending you would expect, to kind of some high fantasy movie or something like that. But in fact, it's just, this horrendous, revenge movie with all the, ghastly deaths and stuff. And then, you have almost this something that almost seems like it would be a final shot and maybe not necessarily a Star Wars, but a type of film like that or something. It was very well done. I guess is what I'm trying to say. But one final question before we wrap up here, and I know, Chris, this was something you kind of got into a little bit in our comments earlier, but is with Panos Cosmatos, are we looking at as potentially a new David Lynch, this generation's David Lynch, so to speak? Colin, do you want to start off with that?
Well, Lynch is always a name that's thrown around. I mean, I'd say David. I can't really say that I'm a huge film buff, but I'm a huge David Lynch fan. So obviously, I was kind of predisposed to liking this, and it is so refreshing to see a filmmaker who is not constrained by those sort of burdens of the 5-act structure or the sort of drawing a map of where there must be certain points of exposition and certain things need to be explained, and there has to be a clear theme that at one point the character steps up and does a little speech that explains the plot of the movie. So yeah, I mean, just in terms of that visual aesthetic and that ambient drone textures and the use of music and just the whole hypnotic nature of it. I mean, there's a pub, quite a nice Gothic pub in my place where they have a secret cinema that plays horror movies till like 3 a.m. So it's kind of got a bit of a grindhouse vibe, and you can just go in there and watch whatever. And they were showing Mandy. I think they managed to get hold of it somehow right after it came out. So it's one of those ones I'm looking forward to going and seeing sometime at 1 a.m. in a slightly hazy, dark, semi-underground Gothic pub.
Yeah, it's another thing that occurred to me too. You kind of emphasized how dialogue is really superfluous in both of Panos's movies, and I was thinking that's really very much a David Lynchian thing as well, where the visuals are really what's driving the story, and the dialogue is almost irrelevant in a sense, so to speak. But Chris, do you want to pick up with that?
Well, I think that I don't think that he in any way is trying to ape or imitate David Lynch, and we certainly have too many of those, people just trying to follow in his footsteps. I think the great thing about him is that, and why he sort of captures the spirit of Lynch, is that he doesn't try in any way to be like Lynch, which I think is really refreshing and exciting. So I think what I meant when I said that, pointing him as being like the possible next David Lynch is that as somebody who's just an extraordinarily unique and fresh voice in the medium, and what I think is a very tired and worn out and ready to collapse. If the cinematic genre or cinematic medium was a horse, you would be getting ready to give it a nice merciful shotgun blast to the head. I think that the cinematic form is really tired, really worn out, which is why people are more attracted to streaming media and binging and so on. One thing that I did want to point out, when I was talking about the connections with Evil Dead, and I don't know if that's something that you guys have picked up on, but Evil Dead was not actually released wide until 1983. It sort of played a number of film festivals and so on, and there was an aborted release prior to that. But I think it's very interesting to me that film was actually released wide in 1983, particularly when you look at a lot of the occult, that it isn't just a slasher film, that there is some sort of occult content, with the Sumerian texts and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly fitting that it would have gone into this widespread audience in 1983 as well. Obviously, given all the other just really amazing and very esoterically inclined movies that were coming out in that year. Well, is there anything else you guys want to add to this podcast here before we wrap up on Panos?
Just the only other thing I was thinking, you were saying about, filmmakers that are doing different stuff. I mean, this is something that I think Frank wants to talk about in later episodes, was Under the Skin, which is the Jonathan Glazer film. And he's someone who started out as a music video director and did some very interesting pop videos throughout the 90s and the 2000s. But Under the Skin is another one that does not follow the rules, and that's another one that was endlessly compared to Lynch, and it has that Kubrickian sort of aesthetic that you see in Mandy and Black Rainbow, but it is with Cosmatos. It's his own thing. You can see that there are influences there, but he's not slavishly following anyone. And it'd be interesting to see where that goes. It's almost like film as installation, art piece, that you can just put it on a wall and look at it.
Yeah, certainly. I hope too the funding is available too, and we're not waiting 8 years again for his next movie. But Chris, is there anything else you had to add?
Oh, I definitely wanted to concur with Under the Skin. I see a lot, particularly with Beyond the Black Rainbow. There's a lot of I can't put my finger on it, but there's just a flavor there that is very similar. The thing that I find a little discouraging, though, is that Jonathan Glazer is 55. Panos Cosmatos is 45. These are artists getting a relatively late start in this medium, and I'm not exactly sure if there are a lot of people in younger age brackets that are willing to take up that cudgel. Doing film is extraordinarily hard work. Almost always you're living in abject poverty or tremendous debt. It's a very difficult and unforgiving medium. There's such a glut of films and television programs and videos and all these kind of things that it's very hard to get noticed. So, where I'm very excited about these filmmakers, Glazer and Cosmatos. I don't know if the future belongs to them, which I find very sad. I always get the sense that this is the tail end of the auteur filmmaker of the kind that we did see with Kubrick in the 60s. That it's just that string playing out. I hope to God it isn't, but my more pessimistic nature tends to make me think that this is not a kind of filmmaking that we're going to see a whole hell of a lot of in the future, and that makes me very, very sad.
Yes,
yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say there very briefly, Jonathan Glazer did make a film recently, which I didn't see. It was 5 minutes long, and it was shown on the BBC just without any sort of announcement, slotted in between a couple of programs. And it's just it's it is apparently only 5 minutes long, and it's like this creepy silent movie that is apparently about Brexit. So, so I'll have to track that down at some point.
Yeah, that is very interesting. But
Oh,
certainly,
I just I can't believe this. Glazer also directed. I just want to. This is a bit of a sidetrack, but he directed one of my favorite all-time movies, Sexy Beast.
Oh yeah.
oh yeah,
Ray Winstone and Ben Kingsley, which that is a movie. I think I've watched that movie about 30 or 40 times. I absolutely adore that movie. And if you're looking for a great, a Guy Ritchie movie done right, definitely see it. Sexy Beast.
Yes, no, that was a good one. But yes, no, definitely. Getting what you were saying, Chris, it is a bit discouraging that these kind of, cutting edge filmmakers are both Generation Xers. Essentially, you really just don't see that with millennial filmmakers coming up. So, yeah, definitely a little bit of uncertainty as to what the future holds in that regard. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate you all guys coming back on again. It's always a pleasure to have both of you on here. And thanks to all of you out there for listening. We will be back next week with Walter Bosley and hopefully a very interesting chat on Aleister Crowley and a bunch of other occultic / parapolitical topics. Until then, stay tuned until next time, and thank you all very much.